Okay.
Okay, now we're set.
Welcome, everybody. I had hoped to maybe come down. You heard I live in Milwaukee, and I'm a Zen commuter to the Zen Center. I'd hoped to maybe come down and give this talk in person, but I'm just getting over a cold, a pretty bad one. So if I go blank for a second, I'm sneezing or something. So I thought it best to stay up here. But I'm really glad to be here, at least with you, remotely and virtually. So I don't know about all of you, but in the course of my years of Zen practice, I've received sort of mixed signals on the issue of whether we should be thinking or not thinking in meditation. I mean, some schools teach, some Zen schools teach that in meditation to even label the thoughts thinking when you catch yourself having a thought. Other schools even teach to label each thought like individually and specifically. So like I'm having a thought about how much I hate my job, or I'm having a thought about how much I'd like an ice cream right now. And then having labeled the thought, right, you come back then to your breath or to your mantra or to whatever your meditative point of attention or awareness might be. To me, this always sounded sort of like skeet shooting of thinking. There's one, boom, there's another one. And you label it and it falls down and you go back to trying not to think. But we also hear a lot from Zen teachers that the idea of meditation isn't to not think either. So thinking isn't bad. Don't worry about thinking. You hear the mind is, if you've heard this one, the mind is meant to think like the lungs are meant to breathe. You're not going to stop thinking. If you try to suppress your thinking, your mind will be more unsettled than ever. There's a writer, Zen master, Matthew Jigsaw Sullivan. He's a Zen master in the Korean tradition, the Jogabe tradition, which is a tradition I used to study in, actually. He is author of a really fantastic modern translation of the Blue Cliff record. That's a seminal record of Zen koans. His translation is called The Garden of Flowers and Weeds. It's fantastic. In that book, in one of his commentaries on one of the koans, he writes, "Try to block the waters of the mind, and they only rush back with increased violence. However, if you watch carefully and channel the flow, slowly the waters calm." That's his take on thinking and not thinking. Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous Vietnamese Zen teacher, recently departed. He wrote in what I think is his best book, Pieces Every Step. Thinking is important, but quite a lot of our thinking is useless. That's what he wrote. So what thinking is important and what thinking is useless? How do we make a higher proportion of our thinking useful? This is something it seems like Zen practice, meditative practice is meant to achieve. Now, as you might have heard, I'm a writer. In fact, since I retired from full-time teaching of writing and literature and journalism, I'm a full-time writer these days, pretty much. And in meditating on this question of what thinking is useful and what thinking is not useful, I thought about something we writers call the inner editor. This is the thought voice that comments on everything a writer puts down. Okay, I talked about this a little in a Dharma talk last year about how writing can be a spiritual practice. Today, we're going to talk a little more. I'm going to use writing as a metaphor for all the life issues that spiritual practice hopes and meditative practice hopes to address for all of us, for anyone, writers and not writers alike. So there's no bigger obstacle for a writer than the writer's own critical mind. That's the biggest thing that writers face. For me, the inner editor sort of speaks in my own voice, but way more harshly and less tactfully than I would speak to anybody. Right? Oh my God, Robert, that's too flowery. That's too boring. That's not the right tone, and on and on and on. And that inner voice will comment on everything that goes down on the page. Um, the wonderful writer and writing teacher, Anne Lamott, she talks about the vinegar-lipped reader lady in her mind who says primly, now that's not very interesting, is it? That's what she has in her mind. Now, left unchecked, if you let that inner voice go out of control, that voice of the inner editor will completely shut down the act of creation. If that editor will after a while, the editor is perfectionistic and it will completely shut down your ability to write, a writer's ability to write. Often that's called writer's block. Okay. So to not get blocked, readers have to learn how to ignore or, tamp down the inner editor. But the paradox is writers also need the inner editor, because writers can't just throw the inner editor away, because if we just wrote whatever popped into our heads, it wouldn't be relevant to anybody but ourselves. We have to have some discernment over what is good to put down for other people to read and what isn't. So the act of writing is largely about knowing when to listen to the inner editor and when to heed the inner editor, and when to disregard the harping of the inner editor and just plunge forward with the writing. To me, that issue is utterly similar to the question of what thinking is useful and what thinking is not useful for practitioners of meditation. Okay. So now when writers are blocked, we know we're thinking too much. That's not hard to recognize. But knowing that is easier than doing anything about it. It's really hard to control our own minds. My late husband, my first husband, used to say, Robert, you can't tell me what to think. And I used to say, I can't tell me what to think. It's the insidious thing about writer's block is the longer a writer is blocked, the harder it is to silence the thinking that's causing the block to begin with. It's like a cycle. The inner editor will start to criticize not just the writing, but the block itself. The inner editor will start to say, you can't write anything. You're worthless. You're blocked. So I think this is sort of similar to the way that all of us can sometimes get down on ourselves when life isn't going the way we wanted or the way we planned. This is similar to the way self-criticism can kind of run out of control when the chips are down and we feel responsible for it. It sends the chips down even further. How do we break this cycle? So at midlife in my 40s, I wanted to make a transition from writing journalism to writing fiction, to creative writing. I went, as you heard in my introduction, I went to a graduate program at Bennington College for an MFA in creative writing to sharpen my ability to write fiction. My thesis at Bennington was a collection of short stories. When I first started writing short stories in a serious way, I tended always to get blocked about 2/3 of the way through the story. I would get blocked right at the moment that the plot needs to turn from building up, from getting more complicated, to being resolved. There's usually, in classic fiction, there's a moment of turning in a story, and this is the same thing in poetry, actually, that goes from building to resolution, and I would tend to get blocked there. One of my mentors at Bennington, who was a wonderful writer named Alice Madison, Mattison, find her books if you can. Her books are lovely. She was one of my mentors at Bennington, and she said, Robert, at that point where you get blocked, you need to go walk the dog. That's what she would say. Go out and walk the dog. So I tried that. I tried taking a walk when I would get blocked. I live right near Lake Michigan. A block away, I have a lovely lakeside path. I would go and walk along the lake. Unfortunately, this did not work for me. I would come back from the walk as stuck as I was, as blocked as I was, as when I left. However, my dog had recently passed into doggy nirvana. I was between dogs at that time. I didn't have a dog to walk. And I mentioned that to my teacher, and she said, well, Robert, the dog is critical. That's the most important part. Because if you walk without the dog, you're just going to keep thinking about the story. The dog is the device to get your mind away from it, to get your mind in a subconscious mode about the story instead of a conscious mode. So the lesson here for meditators is that when thinking has sort of run its course, that's when we go to non-thinking. When we run up against a problem for which our logic and our reason can't find an answer, can't find a way forward, that's the time to leave it in the back of our minds and do something else that will take us away from the task at hand and that chattering mind. However, we don't want to go from that task into something that's so boring that we just keep thinking about the problem, or into some bigger problem that will just busy the mind further. We want to be just distracted enough from the problem at hand so that it stays in the back of the mind, but we can pay attention to something else. So we can walk the dog, we can take a shower, we can take a nap, or if we're Zen practitioners, we can meditate. Writer's block is just like any other life problem that clogs our thinking and blocks our way forward. So thinking that tends to repeat in a loop, thinking that tends to become obsessive over the same themes, thinking that tends to keep us mired in one spot without ideas about action to improve or change or move forward. I think that's the thinking that Thich Nhat Hanh says is useless and occupies too much of our conscious brains. That's what we're trying to get away from on the meditation seat, and ideally out in the world beyond the meditation seat, right? But if we just sit there and think about our problem, if meditation can't get us away from that, it's not going to help. So if walking the dog is the cure when you take a walk, when we're meditating, what's the equivalent of that dog on the walk? What's taking us away from those conscious thoughts? So what thing is taking us away from the problems at hand? Well, in meditation, what we're doing is we're replacing conscious thought with sensory experience. Sensory experience is like that dog on the walk. When a thought arises, like in words to ourselves, we let it float away. I mean, in some schools, we might label it. It's a matter of style, but we let it float away. And then we adjust our attention to the sensation, sound, sight, smell, and taste of the present moment. That's what our mind is full of. It's not thinking, but it's also not thinking. It's content that's coming to us from the sensory world instead of being created by our thinking world. Okay. Now, this includes the sensation of our breathing, which is always there. It can serve as sort of a drumbeat or an anchor, or it can even be a point of focus if our busy minds need it. We can actually consciously use the breath as a point of attention. Some schools of meditation even teach to count the breaths. We teach that in our classes as sort of a starting point for meditation. So instead of focusing on our thought world and all its loops and dead ends, we focus on what is actually happening independent of our thoughts about it. That's meditation. And by practicing that on the meditation seat, we hope to have more of that conscious attention out in the real world. When we move our attention away from what we're thinking and put it on what we're experiencing, that's a good quick summation of meditation, right? Just like we're paying attention to that dog on the walk instead of just walking in our own heads. With time, we may find that the thoughts that break through, instead of being troublesome, are elevated into what some schools of meditation call insight. Okay? So instead of endless looping internal chatter about our hopes and fears and wants and needs, if we focus on experience, the thoughts that come through, we might occasionally be surprised that they sound more like wisdom instead of trouble. And that's a result of we've widened our attention. We're opening our attention field to everything that's happening instead of just our thoughts. And also we're becoming less biased about what comes in. We're not seeing everything within the filter of, is this good for me? Is it bad for me? You have this you have a wider and less self-absorbed viewpoint. And so what might happen is these epiphany, realization moments will come true on issues that were previously cloudy or hidden or blocked. Okay, so here's an example I had, a big example from my life. About 5.5 years ago, some of you know, I lost my first husband suddenly to the widowmaker heart attack, gone in 1 second from perfect health. And that was one of the things that caused me to become more serious about Zen practice. And actually, it was one of the things that brought me to this Zen center. After that had happened, after I lost my husband, a Social Security officer told me I couldn't receive a survivor's benefit. And the reason was because our marriage had not lasted for 10 years. It would have been impossible for our marriage to last 10 years because same-sex marriage was legal only for the last 3.5 years of our time together. We got married as soon as we could, but that was the longest we could be married. We were together 32 years, but married for only the last 3. So I was disappointed about that, but the law is what it is. But in meditation, a few weeks later, an unexpected inner voice came to me, and it said with complete certainty that agent had to be wrong. How could a wife or husband who'd been married 7 or 8 or 9 years have no protection through Social Security from death? It just did not seem logical that everyone had to be married for 10 years before they could be considered a survivor. I called Social Security after meditation. The agent said, "Oh yeah, that guy was wrong. The 10-year rule is if you got divorced before your spouse passed away. For you, the rule's 6 months, and yeah, we'll say, well, you can have the death benefit." And that played a role in my decision to retire from full-time teaching at Wisconsin and become a writer. Now, a full-time writer. In retirement, I've been able to devote myself more completely to writing, which is what I love to do, and especially fiction, which is something I dreamed about when I went to Bennington back in my 40s. And with more space to create now and being more serious about it, I'm finding that these realizations I have in meditation, often they'll relate to whatever piece is going at the time. Even if I'm not sitting there consciously thinking about it, all of a sudden I'll have a realization of, oh, this is what needs to happen next in the story. Now, for a while, I kept a notebook next to my cushion so I could quick write down the realizations and not lose them. The problem with that was I tended to keep writing, and it would pull me away from meditation. I would write, oh, here's the realization, and here's the next thing I have to write, and here's the next thing I have to write. And before you knew it, I'm sitting on the meditation cushion writing, which is not what I wanted. So now I just let the realizations go, just like all the other thoughts that come verbally to mind in meditation. If the realizations are worth putting down the page, I find that they'll last in my mind long enough until I get to the page to put them down. With this steadier writing practice, and I've also had a steadier meditative practice now that I have a little more time and freedom, the writing results are much better. I'm getting pieces published at a better rate than I used to, and the life practice is better. Taking this more meditative approach to writing, I've become wary about thinking too consciously about what I intend to write. Scenes of fiction that are invented by the logical mind tend to fall flat compared with those that come unbidden, like in inspiration to a settled mind. Now, that's not to say that I wait for inspiration to move my fingers. Okay. Like any practice, including the practice of meditation itself, the practice of writing benefits from routine and from discipline and from repetition. I show up at the same day, basically every day to write. 7:30 till between 7:30 and 10 in the morning is the peak time. Now, if I don't have a realization to put down, if there's no inspiration, I practice a sort of noodling at the page. I'll take a running start. I'll take what I've been working on and read and edit the last few paragraphs to kind of get me a running start. Then if I don't have an inspiration, I'll let my reasoning, logical brain sort of dream up the next few things that are supposed to go down on paper. And I'll write it out, even if it feels forced, even if it feels dull, even if the inner editor is sort of rolling his eyes. Oh my God, I'll still noodle around, start, erase, try to get something going with the reasoning mind. I'm at least keeping the story in mind so it can remain a subject when the next inspiration comes. Sooner or later, that next idea comes and the story moves forward. Now, that sort of dance between thinking and not thinking, between inspiration and waiting, that mimics the way I think meditation can help us approach not just the issue of what to write, but all the problems of life. That can be a way that we approach everything that we have to do. When faced with a problem, of course we attack the problem with our reasoning mind. Of course we think about it. That's natural. If we just decided to not think about every problem that came along and wait for a solution to come, that's a recipe for inaction. So it's natural to attack a problem with our conscious mind, our reasoning mind. But as practitioners of meditation, as practitioners of Zen, one big difference is we also have a keen understanding of the limits of thinking. We know that reason can go only so far, okay? We know that problems can't be solved with our thinking mind alone. If problems could be solved with our thinking mind alone, they wouldn't be problems. They'd just be a to-do list. So meditation as a practice, and also Buddhism as a faith, is really about resting in the notion of not being able to know everything, right? Once our thinking brings us to a dead end or an endless loop on the problem at hand, that's when to let the problem kind of recede from conscious thought, put it aside. Instead of allowing reason, the logical mind, to sort of pace in its cage and thinking turns into frustration and it turns into worry, okay? Instead of that, we can focus instead in meditation on sort of the sensory nowness of the problem, of the fear, of the anger, or the sadness, or all the negative emotions flowing from the problem. We can just stop and feel that instead of trying to think the problem out. That by itself will help calm the negative feelings. Try that. When you're feeling a negative emotion, just stop and feel it. Don't tell the story about it. Don't fret about it. Just feel the bodily sensation, and that emotion is likely to start to go away. And that puts the mind in a better state for realization about what to do next. Sooner or later, that next step is going to come. Might be a small step, might be a big step, might be a right step, might be a wrong step. But it's going to be a step of action toward the problem nonetheless, and it's going to be one that's invented by a mind that's less frantic than just a constantly thinking mind. When that next thing to do about a problem comes to us, we reactivate our thinking mind to make that step, to put it into action, and we start the process over again. Thinking, not thinking, thinking, not thinking. I found that this approach helps us turn problems into something like puzzles, or into something like writing our own life story in real time, right? It's something that brings satisfaction in the act of solving, not just the solution, which we may never come to. We some problems are solved only gradually. Some just morph into other problems. I mean, life is sort of a series of problem solving. Life never goes as planned, and that's okay. If we can rest in that and we can take joy in the solving and in the challenges, that's really a key to a settled life. And that's something that I think meditative practice can bring. Now, that's not to trivialize life or to say any of this is easy, right? A diagnosis of cancer, early loss of a loved one. I mean, I've faced both those things the last few years. That's a puzzle no one looks forward to solving, a challenge no one looks forward to attacking. But when we throw ourselves into a life challenge, understanding the limits, the place of reason, exactly what thinking can bring us, and the power of sensory perception as a dance partner to conscious thinking, that can't help but improve the situation over just trying to think it to death. And the bigger the problem, the more potential for growth and joy in the solving. Even the continual problem of our eventual death, of our mortality, can be addressed as like a challenge to solve, to improve the time we have left by making peace with that. By making peace with the impermanence of ourselves, the impermanence of everything, and in fact, the impermanence of our problems. Our problems are as impermanent as everything else in life. So, in using meditation as an aid to problem solving, not just writer's block, but all the problems of life, I think it's really important not to limit meditation to just the seat or the cushion. There are times in life when sitting is not practical. It's just the way it is. Especially when big life problems come that make a lot of demands on our time. When a job gets hectic and demanding, or when a health crisis hits, sometimes that's the time we need meditation most, but that also is the time that we have the hardest time carving a way, a place for it. It troubles me somewhat as someone who teaches mindfulness and meditation here at ZLMC, how many beginners seem to struggle to sit for just 5 or 10 minutes, much less 20 or 25 like we do formally inside the Zen Center. And it troubles me that I've seen some students give up meditation entirely because they feel they can't meet some sort of minimum time requirement. I'll hear things from students like, wow, everything you're saying makes sense, but sitting around just doesn't seem to be me, or I can't seem to find the time. Well, here are some truths that I think are not spoken loudly or often enough by Zen teachers, by mindfulness teachers. 1 minute of meditation can be the minute that transforms you. We never know. A minute of meditation is infinitely better than none at all. And even just a minute of mindful breathing can bring a big epiphany. So we should not feel that there's a time that we shouldn't meditate at all just because we can't do it for a particular period of time. When it comes to meditation, how regularly you do it is more important than how long. For years, I meditated for 12 minutes a morning on my own. This was before I came to a Zen center. The reason I did 12 minutes is because that's how long it took my coffee to perk in the morning. And I never had anything else to do in those 12 minutes. I never went a morning without coffee. And after those 12 minutes are over, I felt like the day was starting without me. When I got to a Zen center, I found out, 12 minutes isn't considered very long. Most practitioners will meditate 20 or 25. But my Zen teacher said, you've built a strong practice because you did it every day. Now, being in a Zen center, I do sit longer, but 12 minutes was great. Whatever fits you is better than not doing it. And doing it more regularly is more important than how long. Sitting is a really good way to meditate, but you don't have to sit to meditate. And in fact, some dedicated mindfulness and meditation practitioners who I've known don't sit at all. So my first Zen Sangha when I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, was in a Korean Zen school, not a Japanese one like ours. And like other imported branches of Zen. It was founded by this celebrated Zen master who came to the US from Asia during the love generation in the 1960s and 70s, when young people here were looking for new forms of spirituality. The thing is, this particular Zen master, a guy named Sung San, at first didn't find it necessary to teach his students sitting meditation at all. It hadn't been a point of emphasis in his Korean order. Mostly in his Korean order, monks sat. Lay people didn't. Now, eventually, he incorporated sitting meditation sort of by popular demand of all these hippies who wanted to look like they were meditating. They felt like they needed to look the part. And so he did that for them. He built traditional sitting Zen into his school, but he continued to teach that more important than sitting is what he would call action Zen. That's the practice of doing everything in life mindfully, where you're letting your sensory experience take priority over your thinking mind. So when you drink tea, only drink tea. When you play tennis, only play tennis. Let your mind be filled with that. When you drive, only drive a car. If you're driving and you're thinking about something other than driving, you're going to run through the stop sign and have an accident. So, and when you're thinking, only think. Just do that. So these days I've settled into practice here at this wonderful Zen center that has a traditional approach to sitting meditation. But in teaching courses, sometimes I will recommend other forms of meditation to students who are having difficulty sitting still or finding the time. Walking meditation is really great for those who don't like being sedentary. You can actually walk and meditate. Pick any route, any pace, walk just like you would normally walk. But instead of letting your thinking mind go, pay attention to the sensory experience of the walk. Instead of a thought world that takes you way away from the beautiful path you're on. A lot of times walking meditators will find that their breath settles into sort of a rhythm with their steps, and it kind of forms a drum beat for the meditation. It's kind of like a mantra. Me, I tend to go in breath 2 steps, out breath 3 steps. I'm walking fairly briskly when I meditate, but everyone's experience is unique. Your mind will find that rhythm. When mind wanders, we let the mind go, and then we just return it to the act and feel and rhythm of the walk. That's meditation. You're not sitting, but that's meditation. Now, ironically, I'm not sure a dog is a help for walking meditation. If you're going to meditate while walking, leave the dog at home and use the sensory experience as your point of attention. Are you a runner? If you run, the same thing works. I used to run. Now I'm 64 years old and every joint in my body doesn't want me to run. But I used to meditate while running, and that worked too. At any idle period of the day, even for a few moments, mindful people can practice what I like to think of as micro meditation. So like when we hit a moment where we're not doing anything, like waiting in line at the grocery checkout, for example, we can take that as a moment to breathe mindfully and let the sensory experience of that and our surroundings be felt instead of our mind going, or instead of being impatient, or instead of pulling out the smartphone. In fact, the impulse to check the smartphone, I find it works as a great cue to practice for a few moments. Take a minute to meditate and to breathe mindfully and feel sensory experience instead of reading your email and getting more agitated about everything that's going on. You know, for as often as I experience an urge to check my phone, I feel like I get the equivalent of a full sitting period in every day just by meditating for a minute instead. Driving, I used to meditate. I used to commute once or twice a week from Milwaukee to Madison, which is to teach. I had a little apartment there, but my main residence was here. So I had this 80-mile commute once in a while. I found that to be a great meditation opportunity. Now, meditating while driving, it sounds like a disaster, right? But mindful driving, like only driving and letting mind be full of that sensory experience, instead of non-driving thoughts, that actually turns out to be the safest kind of driving. And it brings the same kind of benefits as meditating and sitting on a cushion, right? So all this isn't meant to denigrate sitting meditation. I look, sitting stable in the correct posture, in the postures we teach at the Zen Center, with a straight but not stiff back, eyes 45 degrees down in front of us, good posture, ears in line. I mean, all that is really that's a great way to meditate. And meditators have found over centuries that really works. Okay, I mean, we evolved sitting meditation for a reason, but it's not the only way, especially for those who are still building comfort in sitting or having trouble finding regular time to sit, or for those whose personalities are just not about sitting around. So that's my talk for this morning on how to think and not think. I hope it'll be of some help to your practice. This is in part a digest of recent posts on my new blog. So I'm blogging it. I have a blog called Everything in Mind. The blog address is my last name, Schwoch, SCHWOCH. I'll put it up. You can see. .substack. It's on Substack, SUBSTACK.com, schwoch.substack.com. I try to post about once a week. If you subscribe, it's free. It's not a paid thing. If you subscribe, you get an email when I post. And if you thought this talk was worthwhile, maybe you want to go over and check out the blog. So thanks for listening, and I'm open to any questions, thoughts you might have.
Thanks so much, Robert, for that talk. If anybody in the room or online has a question or a comment, I'm going to walk up and turn this back to gallery. So excuse me for just a moment. Oops. Okay. Yes, Sandy.
Thank you, Robert. That was, as always, accessible and very interesting. Would you please put the link to that blog in the chat?
Yeah, I can do that. Of course, people there won't see it, but you guys.
Oh, no, I know. That's a real issue with online and in person, but yeah, thanks.
There it is.
Okay, thank you.
And the last several posts have been about what I'm talking about today.
Just comment. You get a new follower on Substack, so thanks, Robert.
Oh, great! Is that an Arsenal jersey?
Of course, go Gunners!
Oh my goodness!
All right,
I'm a big Gunners fan. You'll see that on the blog eventually, I'm sure. Not Arsenal, though.
I just wanted to say, let me see, I guess I'm not in the screen, but I'll just come over here so I am. Robert, thank you for that great talk. It's always good to be reminded of the many ways that meditation we can practice it in our lives. And I have just a quick comment and then a question. My comment is, I wanted to say that for me, I have found that meditation, I rarely, if ever, have an insight during meditation. But in the rest of my day, I notice my mind is more expansive, more open, less tight. And so things come to me more easily throughout my day rather than during the meditation period. So it's still incredibly useful for me because it opens my mind. So that was my comment. My question, another thing I know that those of us who teach here with some regularity, and I just wanted to get you to comment on it, are people who say they can't meditate because their mind, they can't stop thinking. And, of course, none of our minds stop thinking, but I'm just curious about your comments to that kind of a comment by a student.
One, don't worry about it. And actually, meditation is the act of just resting in whatever's happening, including your thinking. You're meditating if you're sitting there thinking a lot, your mind is busy, but you're just letting your mind be busy and feeling the sensory experience of that. That's still meditation. Meditation is not the act of not thinking. And also, if mind is really, really busy, that's not a bad time to take small bites at it, and do those sorts of micro meditation techniques. So what we're doing in meditation is we're just feeling whatever is going on. And if your mind is busy, we're just feeling that. And just doing that, just feeling the sensory experience of having a busy thinking mind will calm the thinking mind eventually.
Thanks. Any other comments or questions before we close? Yeah, Robin.
Just that it was great, Robert. Thank you so much for this morning.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, keep getting better, Robert.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be better. I'll be down there in several weeks. So
Great.
I'm going to come for Kelly's ordination.
Great, great. Okay.
I'll see you all
Well,
soon.
yeah, thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful Sunday. And for those of you in the room, if you have a few moments and would like to have coffee and refreshments, please stick around. Thanks. Bye-bye.